Okay, well, welcome to Making Worlds Bookstore and Social Center. We're delighted to have the folks that are here in this room gathering around the seminar table in the back of our space, and of course, to be able to live stream this event for those who are not here in the room today or would like to join this conversation at a later time. Making Worlds Bookstore and Social Center is a nonprofit worker cooperative bookstore and social center that is really trying to dedicate ourselves to the task of thinking together about the myriad political, economic, social, cultural issues and problems that are facing us together, and to think through those questions together with a deep sense of mutualism and the ways in which those questions, those concerns, and those problems, the challenges that face so many of our communities are interconnected. And so it's for that reason, too, that we depend dearly on comrades to come join us in this space, in this project, that we can learn from, and to carry experiences of organizing and social movement activity over an internationalist and historical period. In that regard, we're very excited to have and honored to have Olga Sanabria Dávila joining us en route from New York City to Puerto Rico and able to stop off in Philadelphia and join us today. There's so much about the case of the decolonization of Puerto Rico that we, all of us, whether we are part of the Puerto Rican diaspora or are not, or are part of other diasporas who are here in the United States, depend on learning and understanding, again, a sense of our interconnected histories of US imperialism, both here in the United States and, of course, abroad. The experiences of social movements in Puerto Rico over the last handful of years, in fact decades, are also really important because they seem to also connect a lot of the other issues that we're facing at a world scale, both in terms of climate catastrophe and the possibilities of organizing mutual aid centers and other types of responses in the experience of state abandonment and collapse, but also the ways in which recolonization is happening in Puerto Rico and many other places around the world, economically, and what it looks like to survive and fight and resist and organize collectively against programs of austerity and immiseration. There are so many other issues that are intertwined in the story of Puerto Rico, and we're really honored to have Olga here to lay out the case for Puerto Rico's independence and allow us to join that struggle. I want to mention also that we're nearing the end of the year. We have another event that we're planning for December 10th, which is A City and a World Without Police. We've invited a number of scholars and activists in Philadelphia who are organizing around issues of abolition, police abolition primarily. We have in the new year the great hopes to host Johanna Fernandez, historian, militant scholar of the Young Lords, celebrate her incredible history of the Young Lord organization. And we will also be hosting an event around the 20th anniversary of the 2001 Argentinian crisis and social movement uprising in the next couple of weeks as well. So you can look out for event details there as well. I want to also thank Tamar for making a connection and allowing us the space and the grace to host Olga. So maybe I can invite you up to introduce Olga, and then we'll get started with the presentation. Just last thing I'll mention is that the bathroom, for those of us, of course, in the room, is right behind us, right here. Those of you who are not in the room, you're on your own, finding your own bathroom, of course. Thank you for everyone who has joined us today, again, and in the live stream as well. So, Tamar.
Thank you. To the warm faces in the room, thank you for spending your Saturday with us. And for those online, thank you for taking the time to listen. I know Olga personally, and I have been around her for many years now, that I feel very honored to introduce her, actually, and I'm honored to call her a friend. I want to say that, along the spectrum of the political line and where we all find ourselves, there's always more learning. And for me, Olga is somebody that is politically, academically, socially, and just a place that I go to for advice and for learning. And I'm really honored to know Olga. And I'm honored to share her with you all today. Coming from Puerto Rico and just the lessons and how they apply, here locally, and just the importance of Puerto Rico to the United States, where we find ourselves today. And with that, I want to say, some of her background as far as, being trained, as with a law degree, but the enormous commitment to movement building and to working with different groups for so many years. Olga has dedicated her life to to Puerto Rico, but broader than Puerto Rico. And because Puerto Rico's condition and because of Puerto Rico's unique situation with the United States, there's really lessons to the rest of the world and to us here locally in Philadelphia. So I hope we're all going to learn. The format's going to be very simple, and she's going to give like a 20-minute presentation, and then she really wants to have conversation and discussion. So please, let's make it vibrant with questions. And thank you again for being here. Thank you, Olga, for trusting us to join us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the bookstore and the people at the bookstore making this possible. And thank you to Tamar for the initiative. Tamar already clarified the format that we'll use. I'll speak for about 20 minutes. Tamar is going to be kind enough to raise her hand when it's 20 minutes, because after 20 minutes, it becomes maybe a lot, and it's better to just start taking questions. So first, I wanted to clarify regarding my role. Puerto Rico has no official representation at the United Nations. And I, therefore, am not an official representative of Puerto Rico at the United Nations. And I'm also not officially appointed to do this work. I evolved in my political work in that way. And until recently, I did work in the name of an organization. Right now, I would say there's a transition generally in Puerto Rico on the international work, and it certainly is a transition as far as my situation and the way I see my role. So I want to clarify that because I think it's important. I also wanted to start, I'm not really sure the knowledge that you might have on Puerto Rico, so I'm just going to do an overview, and then we'll take the questions, but I'd like to concentrate on the issue of the case at the international level. I think it's really important, this activity, because Puerto Rico, as a colony of the United States, has a number of, it's like a tripod in terms of the elements that are important to ensure the process of colonization of Puerto Rico. And one of the points, one of the areas that are really, really important in that is the area of solidarity from progressive forces in the United States, which I realize is a broad spectrum, including this bookstore. And of course, I begin with that because we are in the United States, we are in Philadelphia, but of course, the work that's done in Puerto Rico, which is really the reason for the existence of my work, for example, and other people's work at the United Nations, which, by the way, I'm not the only one that has worked on this. I've been on a team for a long time, even though, as I said, right now I'm going through a transition. So that's something that's important to say. And then, of course, besides the United States, we have the issue, which is mainly the area that I've concentrated a lot, is the issue at the international level. And at the international level, getting solidarity for Puerto Rico from organizations that are not in government, but the work at the United Nations involves working with governments, lobbying member states of the United Nations to ensure information about what's happening in Puerto Rico, and also to be sure that we avail ourselves of any opportunity for the case of Puerto Rico at the United Nations to have a greater voice, because as I said, we don't have representation at the United Nations. I want to go back to the issue of the United States. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. Puerto Rico welcomes solidarity from the peoples and the organizations of any country as well as from the governments. But in the case of the United States, as I'm sure you understand, this has particular importance. And in that regard, before I get into the issue of Puerto Rico per se, I also wanted to say that within the context of solidarity from the United States, we also take into account the extremely large Puerto Rican community in the United States, which at the present time is 5 million strong. And the work in favor of Puerto Rican decolonization from the community of Puerto Ricans in the United States is not really about solidarity. It's about work in favor of our own interests, right? Because Puerto Rico is the country that we come from, and it's the country that maybe we will return there, maybe we won't return there, but it's still our country, and we still have enormous links to the country. So the role of Puerto Ricans in the United States is extremely, extremely important and extremely relevant. In that aspect, I also would like to mention that historically, within forces, North American forces within the United States, and also within the Puerto Rican community in the United States, there have been many organizations and there have been many initiatives regarding support. And as I said, it's different when it comes from the Puerto Rican community as compared to the North American community. But historically, there has been a process of communication, a process of developing solidarity. I would say that at the present time, there has been somewhat of a lull in knowledge, and solidarity comes out of knowledge. If you don't know the issue, if you don't know the situation, then it's hard to expect mobilization and solidarity. And I think there really has been, in recent years, somewhat of a lull in terms of people in the North American left having that information. So I'm hoping that, and I'm not saying that this is the first activity of a process. I think people from Puerto Rico and from organizations in Puerto Rico often come to the United States and address North American audiences and Puerto Rican audiences. But my point is that this needs to be intensified at the present time. And I'll explain that, and that leads me into what another part of my presentation. When I say that the situation in Puerto Rico is urgent at the present time, I'm not just referring to solidarity from the United States and the work of the Puerto Rican community in the United States, but also the international community and the United Nations. So because of the processes that have taken place in Puerto Rico, ever since we've been a colony, but ever since the Free Associated State was established, and more recently with the innumerable crises that the Puerto Rican people have faced. So I'll begin, and of course I want to remind Tamar to just let me know when about 20 minutes is up, because I don't want to speak too much. But I would like to start talking about the Free Associated State. I think you probably have the background that Puerto Rico was invaded by the United States, that Puerto Rico is a nation forged over 400 years when the United States invaded. Puerto Rico had already received a partial autonomy from Spain, which was the original colonizer, which was usurped when the United States invaded. Initially, there was a military government, then there was a civil government for a few years, where all of the Puerto Rican government was actually appointed by the United States. There was a lot of movement in Puerto Rico, beginning with the major uprising in the 19th century, the Lattice Uprising, which did not succeed in obtaining independence, but it was an important moment because of crystallizing the Puerto Rican identity. And once that was crystallized, that identity as a separate nation, then the movement for independence within Puerto Rico continued. So after the United States invades, and in the first decades of the 20th century, there was a huge movement for the independence of Puerto Rico, which was headed by the Nationalist Party. And it made definite inroads in terms of electoral politics, in terms of trade union politics, in terms of organizing in the United States, and in terms of using a broad range of forms of struggle, including armed actions that took place, which led to political prisoners of Puerto Rico in the 20th century. The response of the United States to this huge movement in favor of independence and to the contradiction that it faced in trying to project itself as a democratic country, but at the same time having this colony in the Caribbean, the United States developed, along with allies, including Luis Muñoz Marin, developed the project, the initiative of establishing the Puerto Rican form of government as a free associate state, which is basically a republican form of government with the 3 branches of government, elections, etc. However, the establishment of the free and the United States and within Puerto Rico gave that response because there was a huge militant movement for independence. So this was an initiative to somewhat make that movement subside. Besides, of course, the repression that accompanied that initiative of establishing the free associated state. When the free associated state was established, a few things happened as a result. There were a few consequences. One of them was that when the United Nations was established in 1945, Puerto Rico was on a list of non-self-governing territories. When the free associated state was established, the United States moved in the United Nations and promoted a resolution in order that the United States no longer be required to inform the United Nations General Assembly on Puerto Rico. So basically, what that meant was that Puerto Rico was taken off the list of non-self-governing territories. So that was one consequence of the free associated state being established. Very important also were the consequences within Puerto Rico, because one of the things that the United States wanted to do was to project Puerto Rico as this showcase in the Caribbean of democracy on the one hand, and on the other hand, how with this relationship, which is sort of hard to define, not a state, not really a republic, not independent, some kind, so they wanted to project that in that relationship, Puerto Rico could progress. So it is a fact that during the first years of the free associated state, there was a certain level of development in the country in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of industrialization, in terms of infrastructure in Puerto Rico. So part of the purpose was to project Puerto Rico as a showcase of democracy and progress, but it was also a purpose of serving United States interests and United States investment in Puerto Rico. So for a while there was that progress, quote unquote, even within that context, there were broad swaths of people in Puerto Rico that remained marginalized. And workers, people in communities, people of color, Black people in Puerto Rico, Black communities in Puerto Rico, but in general, there were broad sectors that didn't receive the benefits that they should have as a result of that status. The other thing that happened, that the free associated state status really did not mean that Puerto Rico would have greater powers to establish its own economic system, to establish its own international relations, including commercial relations, and a whole series of powers that a nation needs to have in order to ensure its progress and in order to ensure its place in the world. Another result of this reality is that Puerto Rico for a while had industrialization, US investment, and some degree of social mobility, even though, as I said, and I always emphasize, that sector that remained in poverty. But the world changed. The world changed, and the economic system in the world also changed. And when that happened, Puerto Rico really did not have the power to be able to establish its own system of international commerce, of production, its own economy. So that on the one hand, it didn't have the power, and on the other hand, the economic model that accompanied the free associated state really became a failure. That economic model had a number of different stages, which I won't go into because it's a little bit lengthy, but basically they were stages of that economic model that really remained in a dependence of the United States, dependence on US investment, and really did not give any room to maneuver in terms of greater development. Besides the fact that the world changed and how that impacted on the economy of Puerto Rico, we would also need to say the different crises that Puerto Rico has faced in recent years. So we have an economic slowdown, we have the natural disasters, we had earthquakes a while back. And another thing that we need to say is that the pro-independence, pro-decolonization forces in Puerto Rico also went through a transition. Puerto Rico has always had a pro-independence movement, various pro-independence organizations that work toward the goal of decolonization. But at a certain moment, the United States strategy in terms of neutralizing the independence movement was to inject Puerto Rico with federal funds, so that many of the demands that the pro-independence organizations and the youth and the student organizations were making were somewhat neutralized, because now there were federal funds for buying food, there were federal funds for housing subsidies, there were federal funds for education, there were federal funds for scholarships. Besides that happening, there was also a wave of repression against these organizations. So all that combination of factors brought us to a situation in Puerto Rico where the United States constantly emphasizes that we are under the plenary powers of the US Congress, so that the facade of the free associated state status that was initially presented has really been torn down by the United States branches of government themselves. And the organizations, given the wave of repression that has taken place, have also transitioned. And part of what's happened in Puerto Rico recently is that there's been a broader level of base organizations, of local self initiatives to address the problems that the Puerto Rican people face, which the government of Puerto Rico is incapable of addressing, especially more recently because of the disarticulation of the political parties, because of the disarticulation of the government structure based on its own corruption, based on the fact that we had a fiscal control board appointed to Puerto Rico after it was realized that Puerto Rico could no longer have access to the world, to loans at the international level. And the fiscal control board actually has worsened the situation in Puerto Rico because its role is to control the budget in Puerto Rico in order that Puerto Rico pay the debt. So that all these factors have really just, if the government itself is a capitalist colonial government, and with all these other recent factors, it's become even more inept, even more corrupt. So the organizations at the base level have increasingly moved in to organize themselves and to give solutions to the problems at the base level. And that has also given rise to a greater consciousness as to the need to organize, and also as to the need to address the issue of Puerto Rican sovereignty, because base organization there's only so much that they can do if Puerto Rico still remains under the plenary powers of the United States government. No power to establish international commerce, international relations, to control its own migratory policies, to control its own to control its own communications. all of these areas that a nation should have power over in Puerto Rico, they're in the hands of the US government. So that's where you have a situation where even though the pro-independence organizations are in a point of, I would say, transition, there is something that's being constructed in Puerto Rico from the base level, which is something that we need to really, really pay attention to. And that brings me also to the issue of the case at the United Nations. On the one hand, I want to make the point that the social movements are not just important in Puerto Rico, they're important in any country. And we've seen that in the Latin American and Caribbean countries in the recent years, where through the social movements and greater empowerment, people in different countries have elected center-left progressive governments that have different levels of commitment to change, etc., but they are in fact governments that are wanting to respond to the interests of the people. What that has led to also is that those governments at the international level, as reflected at the United Nations, accompany those policies in favor of the interests of the people, in favor of land reform, recognition of rights that weren't recognized before, recognition of rights to sectors such as the indigenous, which weren't recognized before. Besides all of that, those progressive governments have also, to some degree or another, established their own sovereign international relations and their own sovereign international political positions that get reflected at the United Nations. So as someone that is within a group of people in Puerto Rico that has worked on the case of Puerto Rico at the United Nations, we've seen these transitions, we've seen the ups and downs of that process, but we've also been able to see a constant development. So maybe in one country, the progressive government, its work is made more difficult, but then another country elects another progressive president. Maybe there's a coup in one country, such as happened in Honduras in 2009, and now 2021, they elect a progressive president. So there's a definite tendency, especially within the Latin American and Caribbean countries, that gets reflected at the United Nations, and that impacts on the case of Puerto Rico, even though we still have a lot of work to do at the United Nations in order for this to be reflected in more initiatives on Puerto Rico. The case of Puerto Rico is extremely, extremely complex. People who we're not facing a decadent, well, maybe we are facing a beginning of a decadent empire, but the United States is still an extremely powerful country, and it's not, this situation of Puerto Rico is not comparable to colonies that had as their colonizers other countries that didn't have the same political clout internationally, the same economic clout, the same military prowess in the world. So even though these situations of change are reflected at the UN, there's still an enormous amount of disequal power of the United States regarding Puerto Rico, and also regarding initiatives at the international level regarding Puerto Rico. So this is a little bit of what is being faced at the present time in Puerto Rico, which makes it more very urgent to mobilize locally. It makes it more urgent for Puerto Ricans in the United States to become involved in the decolonization process, and it makes it more important for more knowledge by progressive sectors in the United States on the issue, and more mobilization to be more vocal in support for Puerto Rican decolonization. I myself am an independence advocate. I've been all my life. But in the presentation of the case of Puerto Rico, depending on the scenario, we can live with support for decolonization of Puerto Rico with different options as solutions to the status issue. But that process has to be fair. It can't be a process that favors one of the options. So in recent years, there's been a procedural mechanism in Puerto Rico that has gained ground and that could be a mechanism to finally set in motion a process toward the decolonization of Puerto Rico under a specific mechanism, which the mechanism that has gained ground is the constitutional assembly, which is a mechanism where all the Puerto Rican people deliberate regarding the future of Puerto Rico. And that would be a much more viable process than the processes of these really illegitimate plebiscites and referendums that have taken place that have really led us nowhere. But it still means that the Puerto Rican people in Puerto Rico and also in the United States have to continue to organize, to mobilize, to be vocal, and to make that link between the social problems that we now face and the need for decolonization and independence, as far as the option that many of us have chosen. I don't know if I'm 20 minutes or not 20 minutes. Okay, one last point. When I mention to people that I work on the case of Puerto Rico at the United Nations, people often say, well, where is that going to get us? The United States is the boss at the United Nations. You have 5 permanent members of the Security Council with enormous power. But as I said before, this is about correlation of forces, and the correlation of forces can change. Besides that, even if the United Nations were still totally under US power, the fact is that the international community has a responsibility in the area of decolonization, and therefore in the area of the decolonization of Puerto Rico under international law. Because under international law, it's understood that there's an accumulated experience based on the decolonization of other colonized peoples, and that therefore there are certain guidelines to decolonization that only international law would ensure. So that's a little bit also about specifically why the case at the United Nations. I hope that this has been interesting to you and that it's filled in some gaps of information or reinforced or just, hearing my perspective on what's happening in Puerto Rico. And thank you for being here, for listening, and I'll take questions.
Maybe, I know one of the answers, but could you elaborate on the 936 companies that were in Puerto Rico to explain to people, how basically they did business in Puerto Rico and basically why they left?
Yeah.
And the other question that I wanted to ask you was, do you see ourselves as sort of like the Palestinians, where they are now have pretty much like a non-member state, but they are there speaking about their issues and as if they were a nation also. And those are my 2 questions.
Okay. The 936, so-called 936 corporations were United States corporations that came under Section 936 of the United States Tax Code. And that code provided for U.S. corporations in Puerto Rico to repatriate their profits in Puerto Rico into the United States tax-free.
Wow.
It's a part of the United States tax code. As a result of that application of the tax code to Puerto Rico, of that section of the tax code to Puerto Rico, many electronics companies, especially pharmaceutical companies, and a number of other areas of the economy.
Petrochemicals?
The petrochemicals were really at an earlier stage of the so-called economic development. It's not really that applicable in the 90s corporations, but the petrochemicals were a stage that also didn't really work. But it's sort of because we had no control over the price of crude oil and the petrochemical industry in Puerto Rico was based on refineries in Puerto Rico. When the price of oil increased, then the petrochemicals were affected, and many of them in Puerto Rico just went out of business. And it's a very complicated industry with a large physical infrastructure, which ended up in Puerto Rico being empty and just rotting and just rusting because they ended up leaving because of the changes that took place. So the 936 corporations had a number of impacts. They further developed somewhat of a middle class in Puerto Rico because the jobs that they offered were highly skilled jobs. And the other effect that they had was that the banks had a lot of money deposited, right, waiting to be repatriated, so to speak, into the United States. But while that money was in the US banks, there was plentiful money in Puerto Rico for a number of types of loans by those banks to the Puerto Rican people, especially for mortgages and cars. So that further led into the development of this middle class. Lo and behold, the applicability of that tax code, that section of the tax code, becomes non-applicable to Puerto Rico. One of the things that affected that was the fact that there was a pro-statehood governor who actually lobbied to have Puerto Rico taken out of the applicability of that code to Puerto Rico because he understood that that was contradictory with making Puerto Rico a state. So there was a process that took place that was one of the factors, but that's what the 936 corporations were about. And they were one of the stages in the economic development of Puerto Rico. As far as the Palestinian issue, there were definitely many parallels between the Palestinian reality and struggle and displacement and the situation in Puerto Rico. So definitely this is a point well taken. But we also know that the Palestinians have waged a huge, massive struggle to have their rights recognized, including their right to develop a state alongside of Israel, which hasn't been implemented, but that's a reality, that's an accord that's taken place. As far as the status of the United Nations, actually Palestine as a state is recognized by the United Nations, but it's not recognized as a full member. It's a member observer state. That's its status. So it has a it has a permanent mission. It has a delegation that works within the United Nations in all the interests of the Palestinians and participates in debates, etc. And I think it's important to also mention on this issue that historically there's been at different levels at different points, but there has been solidarity from Puerto Rico to the Palestinian cause. On Palestine, I would end my clarification, maybe, or addressing what you stated. I happened to be present at the United Nations the day that the General Assembly took up the resolution that had to be adopted in order that Palestine, or what's the authority, the Palestinian Authority, be recognized and transition into an observer member state. I was there at the United Nations, and I have to say that I've had many happy moments at the UN in terms of different causes, in terms of our own cause and things that we've accomplished there, which we can talk about also. And that day that I was there at the United Nations, that the resolution obviously was adopted, was extremely festive. I don't have an official credential to get into the UN, so the credential that I am able to get at times, not now with the COVID, but at times, doesn't allow me into the General Assembly Hall. So I had to kind of like finagle my way into the General Assembly Hall so I could witness the adoption of this resolution, and I finally was able to do that. And it really was a very festive atmosphere at the United Nations that day. There's huge, huge support to the Palestinian cause at the United Nations. But as we know, there are correlations of forces, myriad interests that sometimes conflict, so that the different member states cannot always express themselves the way they would. And the day that that resolution was adopted was a day that it was really manifest that the Palestinian cause has enormous support at the United Nations, just not only because the adoption of the resolution, which was fundamental, but also because of the atmosphere that was present that day. So just to give you an anecdote on the issue of Palestine at the United Nations.
Olga, we have a question from someone who's watching the live stream. The comment and question says, "It seems to me that the decolonization process as opposed to independence is dangerous at this time because of the occupation since 1898 and the current because of the occupation since 1898 and the current disastrous economic, social, and political situation in Puerto Rico. Not sure why some independentistas on the island and here are supporting this approach."
Could you just repeat the last time?
Yeah.
The last part.
Just
repeat the whole thing if you don't mind.
Sure. Okay. It seems to me that the decolonization process, as opposed to independence, is dangerous at this time because of the long history of occupation since 1898 and the current disastrous economic, social, and political situation in Puerto Rico. Not sure why some independentistas on the island and here are supporting this approach, I guess, decolonization as opposed to independence.
Right. This is not a matter of juxtaposing decolonization or decolonization and independence. A decolonization process that would be legitimate would have to take into account the different sectors in Puerto Rico and what they support. But it would have to include independence, and it cannot include the present status, because you can't have a decolonization process where one of the options to supposedly solving the situation is the problem itself. So to clarify that, to talk about decolonization just means to ensure that Puerto Rico is no longer subordinate to the United States and is no longer under the territorial clause of the US Constitution, which is what lends itself in order that the US Congress hold plenary powers over Puerto Rico. So it's not about decolonization or independence, it's independence through decolonization. Decolonization in order that independence be made viable. As far as it being dangerous to talk about decolonization, I think it's dangerous to continue in the colonial situation that we're now under. And we don't have to fear a process of decolonization where all the different options can deliberate on the future of Puerto Rico, as long as the process is fair and as long as the process takes place under international law. Now, to talk about decolonization and to talk about a process toward independence, we need to talk about what would that process look like and how would that process be decided, because you can't have a juridical vacuum where you don't know where does the sovereignty of the Puerto Rican people lie, right? So when we talk about decolonization and the specific procedural mechanism of a status assembly, we're talking about a process where the sovereignty of the Puerto Rican people would be deposited in that assembly. And the delegates elected to that assembly would be the ones to deliberate regarding the best way to move forward in this relationship of subordination and colonialism under which Puerto Rico now exists. And we don't have to be afraid of that deliberation, but we have to ensure that the process is under international law, which would ensure that it's a fair process. The other thing is that people worry a lot, and I'm going more into the issue of the status assembly now, that people worry that the correlation of forces in the status assembly will be lopsided, and the majority of the people there will be pro-statehood advocates, and therefore status assembly would lead us to statehood for Puerto Rico. But the process toward the status assembly contemplates adoption by the Puerto Rican legislature of a law that creates, that mandates, and establishes how that assembly would take place, including how would the delegates be elected, and how a balance would be ensured. And also, hopefully, because that law is not adopted, so we don't know what that law is going to look like. We know drafts, bills of law for the status assembly that have been presented, but none has been adopted. But the law itself, when that law gets negotiated in the legislature, and hopefully in consultation with civil society, that law would have to ensure the mechanisms whereby we prevent that lopsided representation by any one of the different options. And this is something that's being worked on. Now, a status assembly is not going to get us necessarily independence. And it's not going to get people who support statehood, it's not going to get them statehood. But as far as true decolonization and also as far as independence, we need to organize. We need to educate. We need to educate regarding the benefits of independence. And we need to educate regarding the damage that Puerto Rico is suffering. And of course, the present situation has done a good job of somewhat educating on that, right? But what I'm saying is that to have a mechanism that people might agree on and to have this law adopted that would mandate a status assembly, that's not it. It more than anything has to do with organization and mobilization at the base level. And I think that in that aspect, there really is a transition that's taking place in Puerto Rico. It's important that in the face of these natural disasters, Puerto Ricans have, at the community level, have to resolve their own problems. And that has been a process of demonstrating the need for organization and the need for empowerment and the need to address this huge weight that the Puerto Rican people had, which is the colonial mentality, right? So this is not just about, okay, we're gonna have a status assembly and the UN is gonna supervise and everything is gonna be fine. No. This is a very difficult, complex process, but we have to start somewhere. And to the person that questions whether or not this is dangerous, it's dangerous the way we are now. It's dangerous to maintain a situation that is so frustrating that it's gonna lead to more actions that are gonna create more political prisoners in Puerto Rico. That's dangerous, right? But we have the intelligence, we have the sense, we have the interest to work on this and to resolve this problem. And we have to have that confidence that we can do it and not think, well, this is too dangerous. Well, if that's dangerous, what's the option of how to resolve this, right? So I think I'll leave the point on the decolonization versus independence. It's not one thing against the other. I hope I clarified that and other things that I also had an interest in clarifying.
I understand that there have been different movements to have Puerto Rico put back on the list of non-self-governing territories. Those movements having been unsuccessful, mostly around the 1970s. I understand, like Cuba. Can we talk a little bit about the whether there's still a motivation for that and the pros and cons of that?
Okay, there are certain benefits to being on the list of non-self-governing territories because you do have access to certain other forums at the United Nations besides decolonization. So there hasn't been really a consensus in Puerto Rico as to whether or not Puerto Rico should go back to the list, right? There are some spokespeople. This is not something that everybody's discussing every day in the news, but it is being discussed, as you say. There's no consensus. But the argument for putting Puerto Rico back on the list is that it does create certain spaces, certain additional spaces for Puerto Rico at the United Nations. However, When the list of non-self-governing territories was established, international law regarding decolonization really didn't exist as a body of resolutions from the UN. Basically, the mandate to countries that held colonies, and they're euphemistically called administrative powers. The countries that had that power over colonies, what they basically had to do was report to the General Assembly and state how that administrative power was ensuring the level of social, economic conditions of the people in the territory, right? That was their responsibility, right? So when Puerto Rico was on that list, the United States was called upon every year to give a report. Puerto Rico was taken off the list, and no longer the United States no longer had to do that, and had other implications. However, in 1960, a landmark decolonization resolution was adopted in the United Nations, which began to develop that body of international law regarding specifically the decolonization of nations. So it wasn't about this population is living under colonial rule and this administrative power should ensure how those people live and make sure they're okay. No. The new international law regarding decolonization, what it did was it said, peoples of the world have an inalienable right to independence and self-determination as nations. And it establishes a series of guidelines, so to speak, about the decolonization processes. So if we bring Puerto Rico or create these initiatives to bring Puerto Rico back to the list of non-self-governing territories, what we're basically doing is reverting to the application of the processes regarding non-self-governing territories, colonies, that were in place before this very advanced decolonization international law was adopted, which is basically encompassed in Resolution 1514, Roman numeral 15, which was adopted in 1960. And in 1962, there was a decision to create a decolonization committee with the mandate of implementing that specific resolution. There were a number of other resolutions that were also adopted that also addressed the issue, but the main resolution regarding decolonization is 1514, Roman numeral 15. There's also Resolution 1541, there's Resolution 2625, and they establish other parameters regarding decolonization. But the landmark resolution that has the highest hierarchy is Resolution 1514. The other point that I would like to make about this is that in order for Puerto Rico to go back on the list of non-self-governing territories, we would have to have a majority vote in the General Assembly in favor of a resolution that would mandate for Puerto Rico to be put back on the list. And that involves a huge lobbying effort on our part and the part of friends. Maybe Cuba would be included, other center-left governments in Central America, Latin America, and even in the world could also be involved in that. But it's a huge, huge effort, right? To mobilize 97 votes out of the General Assembly, right? If we were going to do that, and it would involve that effort to win that vote, that would bring us back in terms of what's the international law that's applicable, the better option would be to carry out the same effort, but bring the case of Puerto Rico to the General Assembly, so that besides being in the Decolonization Committee, where the case has been examined since 1973, then besides that, the General Assembly would do it. And that would give the case of Puerto Rico much more presence in the international community, and it would create much more pressure on the United States to finally begin to establish a process of recognizing the right of the Puerto Rican people to self-determination, to independence, to the application of international law. So that's a little bit of the background to the debate regarding the issue of bringing Puerto Rico back to the list of non-self-governing territories. And there are people that support it, but there's really no consensus, and there are a lot of questions about the benefits, really, of going back, or an initiative to bring the case to the General Assembly. And that's something that needs to be worked on. Not to bring us back to the list, which I'm against, but to bring us to the General Assembly. In my particular case, that's my opinion. In the same manner that in my particular case, I support independence, right? Even though I support a broad decolonization process, that's the option that I favor. So that's, that's a little bit, and it's a very complicated issue, right? But that's a little bit of the general trends and arguments regarding this issue of Puerto Rico going back on this.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what decolonization means and looks like within a global debt economy.
In terms of, I'm sorry?
Within a global debt economy, what
Within a
decolonization?
global what?
Debt, like financial debt.
Okay.
And I bring that up because I wonder about the limits of a juridical approach, which you seem to be really focusing on about laws, the United Nations, so on and so forth. I mean, it's perfectly legal in the United Nations and elsewhere for like Promesa, La Junta, to do what they do, to have nations that are supposedly independent and free be totally subordinated by financial capital, in a way that Puerto Rico is, in a way that other countries in other parts of the world are. And so I'm just wondering about the limits of what decolonization means and looks like if you are constantly beholden to international credit, if you're constantly having to limit how you spend your money within your own quote-unquote sovereign nation. I guess sovereignty doesn't really exist in the same way.
Maybe you're answering your own question.
No, I'm wondering like what decolonization means then within that framework, rather than just like laws or legal apparatuses that favor capital. How do we break free from that too, in order to really, I think, talk about independence?
Okay. Basically, a nation, as the Puerto Rican people are, needs to have its own state.
Right.
And in order to have its own state, it has to decolonize and be independent. And that's what gives it a role within power over its own territory, resources, how the people are organized, right? And that's what also ensures prerogatives in terms of international relations. And that's fundamental. And I think it's generally understood by all progressives, revolutionaries, that independence does not guarantee a social transformation. But, as I said before, you can't have a situation where you have a juridical vacuum. There has to be a rule of law. And if you're going to decolonize and transition into another status, in our case, independence, you have to have a process whereby that's going to happen, right? And it has to lead to having your own state, right? And that ensures a number of powers that Puerto Rico does not have at the present time, even though it doesn't ensure the power of Puerto Rico over international capital, over the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, right? That's like how far Puerto Rico would go in terms of that type of independence depends on a number of factors, including what would be the correlation of forces within the Puerto Rican people at a moment of that transition? How would the Puerto Rican people guarantee the process of transition? How can we guarantee that the Puerto Rican people receive reparations, which under international law, we have a right to because of the extreme damage that the United States has instilled in Puerto Rico? Right? So it's generally clear that independence doesn't guarantee total self-sufficiency and total freedom from all these international bodies, that we know how they function. They function to the benefit of international capital, of the Western countries, of the G7, right? But that reality doesn't mean that you don't want to be an independent country, because an independent country gives you certain tools in order to move toward confronting those other institutions, which is easy to say, right? But we have that experience of countries that have been independent, even countries with progressive governments, who end up having a very difficult, slow process toward guaranteeing the economic, cultural, social rights of the people, right? So it's a very complicated process, but you have to begin somewhere. And the fact that you're not going to have a total independence doesn't mean that what independence does offer doesn't have an extreme value, including to the Puerto Rican people. Right now, the Puerto Rican people, it's just a total injustice. And Puerto Rico right now is practically in a free fall in terms of the economic condition that the Puerto Rican people are facing as a result of the colonial status and as a result of international capital, obviously, which is what the Fiscal Control Board is actually protecting, right? But I would have to hear the argument, okay, if it's not through independence that we're going to achieve this, then what's the method, right? If it's not through a status assembly and that kind of mechanism, then what's the process? Right? So I think these are complex questions that I don't think I'm going to answer tonight, or that we have the answers here, but that we do have to address them. I hope that somewhat, clarifies the way, that I would approach this.
Thank you.
There's a question from the live stream that is a little bit related to this, or it might be anyway. So we can just maybe address that quickly, which is around the question of an obligation or a demand on the part of the U.S. In the process of transition to sovereignty. So the person is asking, what is the role, for example, of reparations? And maybe it'd be interesting to talk about a set of demands or strategic goals, including debt abolition and others.
Okay, if we're going to address the issue of reparations, then the first thing that we would have to say is that under international law, former colonies have a right to reparations, which means to be compensated for the harm that the colonial status has produced on that people. So in Puerto Rico, it's the colonial mentality, it's the exploitation of our resources, it's the use of our young men in wars, it's the use of our land for military bases and military maneuvers, as happened in Vieques. It's the cultural aggression that we've been subject to. Those are specific harms that the Puerto Rican people, after more than 100 years, almost 125 years of colonialism under the United States, harms that the Puerto Rican people have suffered. It's not that we're imagining these. These are specific damages that the Puerto Rican people have suffered. And under international law, those situations create a right to reparations, which means to compensate, which can be monetary, and it can also be in terms of environmental damage, with measures against that environmental damage, in terms of cultural elements, if there were also reparations, right? And they would have to be, in order for that to take place, international pressure, the application of international law, pressure from within Puerto Rico, and there would have to be a process of dialogue between Puerto Rico and Washington. It's not that Puerto Rico is going to go on its own and with Cuba and this one and the other one get these things. This is the country that we're facing. This is the country that colonized us. This is the country that created these damages, that we have a right to reparations for. So there's an obligation under international law. I would also have to add that international law is like what's termed as customary law, which is the law within nations, the national legislation. International law is the same in the sense that unless there's a pressure to implement that law, then the law just remains on the paper. So in all our struggles, right, in the social movements, political movements, we know that we've been able to get legislation adopted But then to have that legislation implemented, there has to be further mobilization, further pressure, further organization. And the same is true, maybe in a different way, right? Not so simple, but the same is somewhat true regarding international law. If the Puerto Rican people had, once Resolution 1415 was adopted, if the Puerto Rican people, through its leaders and these visionaries that in the 70s said, okay, well, that's adopted, this is applicable to Puerto Rico. But it wasn't just saying, oh, you have to apply that to Puerto Rico. No, they had to travel to the capitals, present the case, lobby at the UN, cultivate friends. And that's how we were able, even though the United States didn't want that, we were able to have the Decolonization Committee examine the case of Puerto Rico and say that Resolution 1514 is applicable to Puerto Rico. It didn't happen automatically. And in the case of reparations, it would have to be a similar process. We have to know that we have a right to this, and we have to mobilize and organize to demand that, including mobilizing the international community, reminding them of their responsibility, and reminding them that this is under international law, that we have that right. And then also engaging the United States in a process of dialogue about this. This is something that is extremely complex and extremely difficult, but we already have certain steps in this process. And it might take a little longer, and we have to further organize, and we have to be more coherent in our organizations and our demands, etc. We have to have more unity, obviously. But this is the way that we can accomplish that. I hope that, addresses.
That was my question.
Oh, it was okay.
Okay.
I just have a tiny, clarifying question from your sort of introduction. Is who grants the status assembly? Is this something that has to? Is this the U.S. government would have to facilitate this, or it's
No.
internal? Okay. Or
It
is it
wouldn't
the UN?
necessarily be the U.S.
Okay.
government.
Okay.
In an ideal situation, the way it's been conceived, that a status assembly as a procedural mechanism could work, would be that the Puerto Rican legislature, which is a colonial legislature, that adopt legislation in favor of a status assembly. Now, even though the Puerto Rican legislature is a colonial legislature, when the Free Associated State was established, there was a constitutional assembly that took place. And that actually was called a constituent assembly. That constituent assembly adopted a resolution, which was resolution number 23, that said, yes, we're establishing this Free Associated State, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm saying it in very informal terms, but basically it said, but in the future, if the Puerto Rican people want to revise this relationship under these terms that we are entering into, we have a right to do that. So under Puerto Rican law, so to speak, and Puerto Rican procedures that led to the Free Associated State, that it was like a precaution that was taken through a specific resolution, which had weight, right? Resolution has weight, especially if it's a constitutional assembly. So that was ensured under Puerto Rican law. And that enables the Puerto Rican legislature to adopt a law to mandate a status assembly, because that resolution exists. So it authorizes the Puerto Rican legislature to do that.
Yeah.
Now, what that legislation is going to look like depends on a lot of factors, but in terms of who authorizes, it's authorized under Puerto Rican law, even though it's colonial law, okay, to do that. Under international law, there's also a right to do that, because when Resolution 748 was adopted in 1953, that's the resolution that took Puerto Rico off the list of non-self-governing territories. And that resolution, even though it recognizes this so-called self-government that the Free Associated State would ensure, it also states, if the Puerto Rican people in the future want to revive, if the Puerto Rican people and the American people in the future want to revise this relationship that they're entering into, they have a right to do that. So under international law, there's also that right to revise the relationship, and we can decide that the mechanism is the Status Assembly. Under US constitutional law, the US Constitution provides for a remedy. If US citizens feel that their rights are being violated, etc. So we could even under US constitutional law say, well, we're US citizens and our rights are being violated because we don't have a right over this, we don't have equality in funding in this area, that area, and we need to remedy, and we have a right to that remedy. So under US constitutional law, there's also a right to revise the relationship, and the Puerto Rican legislature can adopt a law to mandate that Status Assembly. I should also say that there has to be certain minimal requirements that law, that legislation would have to include. That would be that the sovereignty of the Puerto Rican people is deposited in that assembly, so that the delegates that get elected to that assembly are actually representing the Puerto Rican right to sovereignty. It also would have to establish the transition. It would have to establish how that dialogue with the United States would take place. It would also have to establish how those delegates get elected in order that not all post-statehood advocates be elected as delegates. Those are all part of the process. But the fact is that they have a right to do that. How far that law will go and what will be the terms of that law depends on what the correlation of forces is in Puerto Rico, in civil society, and also within the Puerto Rican legislature at the time that the conditions are right for that legislation to take place, right? But basically, there are different areas of law that substantiate the solution to the colonial problem, and a Status Assembly is part of it. The last thing I'll say about the Status Assembly is that the Puerto Rican Bar Association is very different from other bar associations in the United States, for example, because it's a bar association that doesn't just concern itself with the rights of lawyers and when they get sued and when this happens, that happens. The Puerto Rican Bar Association very much gets involved in civil rights issues in Puerto Rico. And it's been involved in the issue of the colonial status and the need to resolve the colonial status. So the Puerto Rican Bar Association, which by the way includes statehood supporters, free associated state supporters, free association supporters, pro-independence supporters, the Puerto Rican Bar Association has developed a model for a status assembly, which has begun to gain ground in Puerto Rico. Those are important developments. And then, of course, we would have to really have that international presence and support. And, we would have to engage with the United States. At the present time, there's a bill of law in the U.S. House of Representatives that was submitted by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Nidia Velázquez, which calls for a self-determination bill, which bill calls for a status assembly. That legislation is not perfect. It emanates from Washington rather than from Puerto Rico, but it actually states that the Puerto Rican legislature should adopt a law for a status assembly. So it's something to be mindful of, that legislation is pending. There might be public hearings on that bill of law. It's not likely, but supposedly the president of the committee in the U.S. House of Representatives that deals with the issue of Puerto Rico, the president of that committee said that he wants that bill voted on before the end of the year. I mean, December 4th already, so unlikely. But that's the situation. And there's also a bill of law mandating statehood for Puerto Rico, which is even less likely to move forward. I want to also, before I conclude, because I think maybe we're running a little bit late on time, there's been a campaign by the post-statehood advocates in Washington and the United States stating that the status issue in Puerto Rico and statehood is a matter of civil rights of the American citizens that live in Puerto Rico. And we need to really, really counter that narrative, because Puerto Rico is not just a bunch of United States citizens that happen to live in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a nation.
Yes.
And what we are claiming in a process for decolonization is also the recognition that we're a nation and the affirmation that we're a nation. So this is not about civil rights meaning. This is about the rights of a nation to self-determination.
Yep.
And decolonization and independence.
My question two, one is around the economics of all of the powers that are currently there, that are continuing to reap huge profits. How do you see them leaving? What kind of relationship can you imagine, what that will look like? Because a good Puerto Rican friend that I invited to come today said, it's not really my politics, because I don't want to see Puerto Rico like a failed Caribbean state, And then my other question is just, you as an independent advocate, why did you choose the route that you chose in terms of making the case for Puerto Rico? It seems like, so many other people have chosen, whether became political prisoners, whether work with foundations, nonprofits, et cetera, and, having the background that you have and continuing to advocate where you advocate from, to me, it's such a unique vantage point of being not your armchair revolutionary and not just a community organizer with all my love to them, it's very unique and it's inspiring, because I know that you've done it at a cost, other costs, and I want to hear more about that.
Okay, first, in terms of the economic situation and U.S. investments in Puerto Rico, I don't think that moving towards the status towards decolonization and independence is about, well, once we achieve that, everybody out. No more U.S. investment, no more U.S. corporations. I mean, even the most belligerent independent countries want foreign investment, right? But if we were to have that power in our hands to really legislate, we could establish certain parameters of workers' rights, even within the context of foreign corporations in Puerto Rico and in the context of foreign investment in Puerto Rico. If we have this corrupt, incompetent, uninterested legislature, do they care about workers' rights? The answer is no, right? We need to have a true Puerto Rican legislature that truly cares about the Puerto Rican people. And maybe then we can really have workers' rights legislation that even those workers will still be exploited, right? As they are in all the countries of the world practically, right? But we would have it in our hands to somewhat negotiate under what conditions, and that those conditions be better, and that those conditions include trade union organizing, right? So that would be how, I would answer that, right? I mean, it's not even just about that all countries in the world want foreign investment. They also all want to have a good relationship with the United States, as good as they can have, right? But what's the price of that so-called good relationship, so-called improved relationship? Depends on what power do they have in their hands, right? So this is a complicated world we're living in, where capital rules, the market rules, violence rules, military intervention rules. But we also have this undercurrent of people's movements that really is beginning to make a difference, and we have to trust that, right? But we're not going to have this all or nothing. After independence, everybody, it's just not going to happen. And as far as my work at the UN, I integrated very young in the movement for independence at a community level. I was a member of a base committee where we did all kinds of work, and we did really crazy things, right? And we worked and we had this idea of Revolution Around the Corner, which is a book that was recently published, that gathers this experience. And at one point, I also became involved in the newspapers, so I kind of developed those skills. And then I have as far as the way I see it, the good fortune of getting the opportunity to work in the diplomatic mission at the UN. And that experience was really very much, I was always interested in international affairs, relations, etc. And that opportunity at the UN really furthered that interest, and I also learned a lot. And then I just began to do the work at the United Nations, and it happens to be an area of work that I really have a passion for. And besides that, I always try, and I think most of the people that work at the international level, because I'm not the only one that does this, I'm not the only one that sacrificed, I'm not, and most of us really make an effort, and I know I certainly do, to maintain a relationship and a knowledge about what's happening in Puerto Rico, in the organizations, in the communities, in the new organizations, new movements that come up. What are they about? What are they doing? What do they propose? So I think that's also been very helpful to me in working at the UN. But ultimately, I really feel that the case of Puerto Rico needs to be resolved, and that the area of international support and applying international law is a valid area to concentrate on, while other people concentrate on other things.
No, I was going to just ask that you make a plug, because I know you're doing this work independently at this point. How can all of us support a little bit financially, but also people that are tuned in? How can they support your work, people that are online watching you?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank the people that are online watching us in the same way that I thank people who are here tonight. And I think that one of the most important things is for people to get the information about what's happening in Puerto Rico. There are a number of websites that have information. We're in the process of developing an international bulletin on the issue of Puerto Rico that we distribute at the UN, but we will also distribute broadly. But the most important thing is to seek out the information. The information is not going to get through. There's a curtain of silence regarding Puerto Rico, especially regarding the Colonial Mentality. Which makes Puerto Ricans in the United States somewhat invisible. I mean, it's inconceivable that we have 5 million people, 5 million Puerto Ricans in the US, and there's hardly any news ever, unless it's a huge storm, unless there's Ricky Martin, what's his name, Mark Anthony, J-Lo, all of that. But other than that, our leaders, our accomplishments in the United States, is like they go under the radar. And there's a reason for that. If that gets projected, you would also have to project what the situation is in the country. And many activists in the Puerto Rican community, and even artists, etc., are aware of the colonial status, and they'll talk about it. So I think it's important to really have that information, because solidarity and mobilization are based on information. If you don't have the information, you're not going to. And I think that the Puerto Rican community also needs to, and I think that's beginning to happen more, also needs to engage. Not just Puerto Ricans in the United States, but non-Puerto Ricans, North Americans, African Americans in the United States on the issue of Puerto Rico. This is a crucial. We're 5 million in the United States, 3.25 million in Puerto Rico. I haven't even begun to talk about the conditions that we face in Puerto Rico, And we're a colony of none other than the United States. Doesn't that matter? And as a result of being a colony, the human rights of these more than 8 million people are being violated every single day. And this facade about this free associated state and self-government and progress and blah, 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 that's all in a free fall. So our situation merits more outspokenness on the issue. And there has to be more work by the Puerto Rican community to get that done. And people who are conscious need to also seek out the information. That's what I would say. And as far as economically, I think we were going to pass the hat around maybe, but that's, not the main purpose of this activity. And if you want to donate on a continuous basis, you can contact the websites that are up. There's a meme website, there's a website of the Unity Sovereign Movement, there's a website of the Citizen Victory Movement, there's a new movement, and you can contribute to anything. And ultimately, it might filter to the international work somehow. So there are many things that, that can be done, and definitely the economics is an important area. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Olga, for joining us here today and sharing so much.